There is a major difference in the way that the Department of Homeland Security is behaving under President Biden versus his predecessor, President Trump. Today, I want to talk a little bit about those differences and do a deeper dive into what would constitute a good use of the government's enforcement priorities. It's no secret that the US government has limited resources to enforce its vast immigration agenda, whether that comes to border security or immigration enforcement in court, hiring new immigration judges, hiring more ICE officers to find people who have deportation orders. All of this comes out of a limited budget. And the government has historically used enforcement priorities to determine who is a priority for deportation, who is not a priority and is not a security threat to the United States, and they'll draw these lines in the sand. These lines are moved from president to president, but there's usually a line in the sand somewhere. And I'll give you examples. So in 2021, the current Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Mayorkas, issued a memorandum saying that people who entered the United States before 2021 are lower enforcement priorities than people who entered after 2021. And that we should use our limited resources to deter people who've recently entered so that if they're deported, it'll stop the tide of immigrants coming in when they see that recent entrants have been deported. That's kind of the policy reason behind it. Also, criminals and people who are a danger to the United States are enforcement priorities. It makes sense to prioritize certain people and to deprioritize other people. A great example of this actually is DACA. DACA, which is known as Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, is not a real law. It's actually the president just using his powers to deprioritize these kids who entered through no fault of their own and to give them work permits, which the president has the power to do, even if someone has a deportation order, interestingly. Now, let's compare this with Trump. Trump said anyone who is in the US without authorization is a top enforcement priority. Now, on paper, that might sound good to some people, but in reality, it was actually a disaster, and this is why. People who were in the US for 20 or 30 years and who've lived relatively law-abiding lives were now in fear of being actively deported. The Department of Homeland Security attorneys had power to determine whether they wanted to deport somebody or not. But under Trump, they lost that power. And the ones with whom I spoke weren't really happy about it. They like to be able to sit there and say like, okay, you've been in the US, you went out of your way to pay taxes even though you're here unlawfully, you have a US citizen child and strong ties to the United States, you've never been convicted of any crimes, we're gonna exercise our favorable discretion to close your case and not actively deport you. We're going to use our limited resources to go after this other guy who just got convicted of a bunch of crimes and is also here illegally. That sounds like good policy to me. As a result of Trump's policy of making everyone an enforcement priority, what happened was the immigration courts, which were already backlogged, are now insanely backlogged. And it happened during the pandemic. So the courts are now adding all these people to removal proceedings and getting backlogged. The Department of Homeland Security attorneys lose the power to close cases that are not enforcement priorities. The whole system gets jammed up. And in the end of the day, no one's getting deported because no one can get the work done. Regardless of your politics, Trump's policy created a crazy backlog to these removal proceedings where US officials are now trying to go after people who historically were not enforcement priorities. It kind of shakes up communities where immigrants are mixed with US citizens. For example, immigrant father with several US citizen children and a US citizen spouse is now getting actively deported despite never before being an enforcement priority. This created backlogs and really made it difficult for judges and Department of Homeland Security attorneys to do their jobs. It also put a drastic strain on government resources. Now, fast forward, and Biden kind of did the exact opposite. He now says anyone who entered before 2021 is not an enforcement priority. So all those people who are being actively removed from the US, if they entered before 2021, now we are able to dismiss those cases and get them off the immigration court's dockets. So one president just loads up the court. Next president kind of tries to reduce the pressure. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. I know that the news likes to play both sides and is really quite confusing. My office gets calls all the time from people who heard something on the news which isn't actually true. So I thought it would be interesting to make a video about the perspective of an immigration lawyer who actually has to interact with these judges and Department of Homeland Security officers and ICE enforcement and removal operations officers on a daily basis. If you guys are new to my channel, this is all I talk about, and I'll be putting out weekly content, so be sure to subscribe.